Hi, I am Judith Kelley, Dean of the Sanford School of Public Policy here at Duke University, and I am so pleased to welcome you to our conversation this afternoon. This conversation is part of our year-long celebration at the Sanford School of Public Policy. We're celebrating 50 years of public policy at Duke University. And I'm so pleased to have this conversation today. We're going to be focusing on trends and challenges and solutions for our national security apparatus. This is a concentration we have here at the Sanford School of National Security in our master's program. And we're also launching a new mid-career program with this focus now. So if you're thinking about getting a professional degree while working, you should check out our new program that we're launching. However, let's get right to the conversation because we've got a couple of great panelists for you today. And I should just start by saying that throughout this conversation, feel free to pop a question into the Q&A. I'll monitor that, and others will help monitor that, and we'll get your questions worked into the conversation. So today, we've got two folks with us. Sue Gordon is the former U.S. Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence and Duke University Rubenstein Fellow. And Tim Nichols served as an intelligence officer in the Marine Corps for over 21 years. And he has extensive experience in the special operations and counterterrorism fields. And he's also teaching here at Duke University and helping head up that new professional degree program that we're launching now. So I'm going to jump right into the conversation with thinking back to just very recently. We had General Mark Milley here at Duke giving the fall 2021 Ambassador Dave and Kay Phillips Family International Lecture, and he really details some of the 21st century national security challenges, such as military involvement in domestic affairs and the growth of foreign military powers, et cetera. And so I'm just going to ask each of you, what will you add to the list of the trends and challenges that you see right now? And then we'll move into a conversation more about the apparatus and how it needs to adopt to meet those things. So I'm going to start with you, Tim.
Okay.
Take it away.
Okay, well, thank you, and welcome everyone. I thought General Milley's comments were very good from a military perspective. I think the problems are bigger than that. And I just thought I would highlight a couple trends that we're a little unprepared for. Part of it is politics, part of it is we've been distracted, and a number of other national security challenges. But I thought I would talk about them and then turn it over to Sue. So the first problem I see is that we have a lot of fragile states in the world, probably more than ever. Nearly 7 out of 10 of the states of our 193 countries are listed as fragile, meaning they're having a hard time caring for their people, they're having a hard time governing. And when you have that, you have a lot of destabilized nations, which affects the economy, which affects human rights, which affects trade, which affects global warming. And so one of the trends that we have to get our arms around, and perhaps a trend that the United States hasn't given enough attention to, are these fragile states. So that's the first one. A derivative of that is what President Biden says, the competition between the movement towards authoritarianism and democracy. And I'm very happy to say the United States is really bringing this to the forefront in this idea of highlighting authoritarian states and their behavior and how they are affecting negatively adjacent countries, their near abroad, and in many cases, their citizens. The third trend is these non-traditional challenges. I'm pleased to see challenges like climate change and migration and pandemics and cyber threats starting to enter the lexicon of our Congress and our executive branch. It's a little bit overdue, but these are non-traditional challenges, not the military forces posturing on the border, although we have some of that. These are other challenges, and our apparatus has really struggled to adapt to these challenges. When we think of policy, we think of the authorities, we think of the resources, and we think of the priorities that are put into place to help leaders deal with problems. And so the question would be, what's our global climate change policy? What are our immigration policies, and are they effective? And if not, do we need more of the authorities' resources and priorities to contend with them? And the last trend that I want to talk about is If anybody, just for fun, reads the Global Trends 2040, the analysis by the National Intelligence Council, which I find fascinating, they highlight growing dissatisfaction with governance. And that is something that happens in the United States and abroad. We have a lot of fracture in the United States now. We've seen a lot of political dissent. We struggle to make compromises. And so when we have this internal gridlock or internal dissent, not good old political dissent, but when we have the type of gridlock that we have now, effective governing is hard for no matter who is in charge in a cabinet position or the elected leader of the nation. And so I'm very pleased to see more and more pieces of scholarship put out regarding these trends. And I'm really excited to see a number of talented people try to address them, but we have a long way to go. So I thought I would mention those, and then Sue, perhaps turn it over to you. And I know you have some comments on this.
Well, great, Tim. Thank you. Those were, I agree with all of them. Again, I also thought General Milley was very appropriate in his comments. I'll push off in a little bit different direction. The first is, this is a disrupted world. And I think we look at leaders and we think that they are disruptive. They may certainly be, but the times are disrupted. Mostly, I believe, because of three trends. One, every technology is available to everyone. And so it's not the presence of technology, but the use of technology that makes a difference. And that tends to favor developing rather than developed nations because they have a less installed base. It's a digitally connected world, and that changes so much about aspiration, about reach, about knowledge, about speed. And third, it's a world of data abundance, and it puts the premium on people that can use data for advantage, and those people without data are massively disadvantaged. And if I put all those three things together, what I will tell you, this is a world where all the threats and opportunities go through information. And that is not a world that our systems are typically designed for. So that disruption is huge, and it applies to both the operations of, from geopolitics to political institutions, to governance and leadership. So that's one. The second is the definition of national security or global security that was disproportionately the purview of governments and was disproportionately political, military to ensure and preserve, is now the purview of everyone. The private sector and the populace are just as much the threat surface of those who would exert their will, and they are security decision makers with the actions they take in a globally connected environment. And you see this over and over. So it really does test who are affected and making decisions about security differently than when it was the government who were mostly making those decisions. And then the third is this disruption and the rise of a connected world has meant that the forces are more economic than they are political, military, and economic forces are more situational. And what you see now is a rise of what I call pesky sovereignty, where people are making their own deals for their own purposes based on more ubiquitous offerings rather than protective security agreements. And to Tim's point that I thought was so good, you're really seeing the institutions that we have that were designed in an earlier time, struggling to keep up with a world that just isn't obeying the rules that we designed our rules to preserve. And so whether that is the preservation of critical technologies or how you form alliances, it's all being tested by this, what I'll call digital disruption.
So you're supposed to make us feel better. the message I take from both of you is that this is a different world than it was just even 5 years ago. And that the speed at which it's changing is accelerating itself. Its contours are changing, or even if there are some of the things that are the normal contours we used to look at, which is democracies and authoritarian regimes, that those have shifted. So change. And yet we look at our security apparatus and how much has it changed? Has it changed enough? Is it even nimble enough to change?
So I'll start, Tim, and then you make it better. There is good news. Well, there is lots of good news here. It is a challenging time, and we are going to have to adapt to it. But we have had challenging times to which we have adapted before. So I'll just say that. I think the good news is, actually, Judith, things changed 15 to 20 years ago. We now see it in part because of COVID with much more clarity. We see the connectedness, we see what's happening. And so now I think what you have is an opportunity. And I think in this administration, you're seeing a recognition that we need to address some of these changes, as I say, whether it's climate and domestic extremism and economic insecurity as being now national security issues. The recognition that those must be dealt with by a security apparatus, I think, is a great first step. I think it's a great first step that you're starting to see some executive orders around this that are a little bit more crossing barriers between the national security community and the economic security community, between the Department of Defense and the Department of Commerce. So you're starting to see those boundaries. I think where we're really going to see the challenges is how you implement that, how you take those policies and say, okay, now what are we going to do about it to actually succeed in this world? So good news, we're recognizing it. Good news, we're starting to put policy framework around it, work to be done in terms of how you actually turn the ship to act differently in a world that demands that.
Tim, do you have any thoughts you want to add there?
I do, thank you. And I'll address it in two ways. The first is with Congress. If anybody's read the 9/11 Commission, there's substantial recommendations about Congress redoing some of the committees overlapping, the committees kind of canceling each other out, and a lot of competition. And that's probably one of the least least addressed pieces of the 9/11 Commission, is really getting Congress lined up to support these challenges through the construction of committees and the refinement of the committee structure. They're so important for the long-term vision of our nation, and we've fallen short there. And it's not through the fault of any specific congressman. They just haven't really tackled this issue. The executive branch seems to be more energetic about aligning the structure towards these problems than does Congress. And so that's my first recommendation. My second one is we tend to, in the executive branch, they tend to need Congress's help to reorganize. If you ask the DOD if they need to reorganize, they'd say, we're just exactly perfect the way we are. And if you ask the intelligence community, they would say, we're perfect the way we are. And what we found is that with the assistance of Congress and perhaps some presidential oomph, we reorganized the Department of Defense to provide better strategic advice to the president in 1986. And even though a lot of the military opposed this reorganization, it's been very effective. It's probably time to do that again. In 2004, we reorganized the FBI and the intelligence community to put very talented individuals like Sue at the very top to try to service the elected leaders and the key senior cabinet members in a way that made sure that all of the effort would be brought to bear to help them make good decisions. So those are examples where Congress had to help the executive branch get itself organized and to change some of the structure. As you know, the government is really difficult to change. So the apparatus itself is being called into question. And if I can be candid, there's one organization that hasn't been refreshed in a while. The DoD is 1986, but the State Department could really use some assistance. We make such talented foreign service officers, but the way that the State Department plugs into the rest of the apparatus has been wanting for a while, not because of the individuals, but just because of some of the glitches in the apparatus. So I just want to bring those points up.
Tim, there are two great examples on both your points, or one, and it's really cyber. So one of the real challenges is if you're going to brief on cyber to the Congress, you have to hit the Senate Intelligence Committee, the Armed Services Committee, the Judiciary Committee, and the Homeland Security Committees. And if you want to establish policy, it has to go through all those, and that's just an untenable situation. So that's one that's trying to be addressed. Organizationally, you have every organization doing a part of cyber, but it was a Congress that actually instituted the formation of CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And I think you would argue that we now have the foundation of something that could be that cyber organization that helps what I was talking about, is that bleeding of threat to the private sector in different ways than it has before. So I think there are examples where in cyber that's proved both your points that are incredibly apt.
So Sue, let me follow directly up on that. And because when we're talking about the apparatus being responsive, we know so often that it's about where resources flow. Resources flow, procurement flows, and organizations have an interest, a vested interest in reproducing themselves and sustaining themselves. And so with the big swing to information, as you talk so much about, Sue, and the examples you just gave now, does the system need the type of jolt that it would take, like to create a cyber force for us to really be able to focus those efforts in an intelligent and nimble and effective way?
So I do think we're going to have to look at our budgeting process, because one of the things that happens is we do bottom-up budget builds, and that preserves everything that exists, and you're trying to fit the future into what's left over. You need to start doing some top-down budget builds. I'm not a fan of jumping to form a new organization either every time the organizations that you have aren't doing what you need. There's so much overhead in a new organization, and typically what means is you have less talent available because all the talent is in the other places. How do you staff it up anew? And the other thing about cyber is one of the things that has to happen is that digital has to become a part of everyday operations. We have to stop thinking about cyber as something technical and different, and recognize that it is the way that the interests of everyone are being accomplished now. So I don't know that I think a cyber force is really the way to go. I think focusing on what our policies regarding cyber activities are, and make sure that the organizations that we have are staffed and resourced to accomplish the mission within. The one caveat might be that I don't know that we have an organization in the United States right now that is particularly well suited to handle domestic extremism, because it is neither an intelligence operation, nor is it a straight law enforcement organization. And I think there's probably some challenge there.
Tim?
I agree with Sue. I don't think we specifically need a cyber force. I think there's a number of cabinet level cabinet agencies that have cyber capabilities, and as long as those cyber capabilities help them in their specific mission, then if you have the policy right, it should work. But I worry about any kind of organization that just aggrandizes more missions and asks for more money, and the ability for it to service the broader community is constantly challenged. And we've seen this in a number of cases where, perhaps the military grew in its mission sets in Afghanistan and Iraq to take on missions that for which they were not appropriately trained or resourced, which they did not have the exclusive statutory authority, but they were trying to make the best of the situation because other cabinet agencies weren't contributing. We don't want to get into a situation like that with cyber. Instead, we want strong central policy, a resource line that's agile, and then we want to train cyber technology or invest cyber technology at the appropriate distributed levels. So the further you are away from strategic cyber, the fewer capabilities you'll have. And the closer you are to the strategic capability, the ability to do things like attack other countries or attack or disrupt terrorist organizations, those would be held more centrally, probably not by the military. That would be my suggestion.
So I'm going to actually take a question that has come from the audience already, and partly because I want to encourage members of the audience to think already now, if you have questions that you think are relevant to a point that's just been made, go ahead and pop them in. There's a question from, I might mince up your name, Youngmin Lee, and it's about really, when we're talking about national security, do we have the scope right when we think about what comes under the national security apparatus? Because veterans affairs and healthcare policy, for example, should we be thinking of those as essential elements of the national security apparatus? And there's a specific point being made with so many veterans having been part of the January 6th event on the Capitol, and then tying that into mental health services and receptivity to extremism if you don't get the right kinds of services. So do any of you have thoughts on, I guess, veterans affairs in particular, and how we think about mental health for our veterans, and thinking of that as a national security instability Achilles heel?
Yeah, let me take a shot at that and see if Sue has something to add. The first question, I think, Youngmin Lee, I think your numbers are a little off. I think 1/5 of the individuals probably had law enforcement experience and military experience and some other kind of national experience. So I don't think that the numbers exactly portray those with just military service. But you bring up a very good point, and our current Secretary of Veterans Affairs, Dennis McDonough, has talked about this. This is a challenge. If you ask me what it takes to treat veterans who have been scarred or mentally incapacitated after a war, I would say it takes more than you can ever give. And so the lesson to be learned is, let's try to avoid military conflict as much as possible. But the honest truth is that the VA is never resourced well enough to attend to some of these problems. So it's not a service responsibility once they're retired, it's a VA responsibility. And if your insinuation is that these people threaten the United States or become a domestic security problem, I would say that that is such a small portion of the military retired community, and that by and large, so many military veterans have retired, they're serving their country in so many different ways that I don't see it as a national security threat. I see it more as a regrettable reality that veterans need a ton of care if we've sent them to war for 20 years and they have disabilities, both mental and physical. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, let me jump to a question that I had, and it ties in with what we've been talking about with cyber, and it also ties a little bit in with other questions that have come up in the Q&A. So, about a week ago, the European Union announced something called the Global Gateway Project with, 300 billion euros or something for the foreseeable future. They're going to start to invest, and it's in overseas projects, specifically digitally related, cyber related types of projects, but it's clearly intended as somewhat of an answer to China's Global Belt and Road Initiative in the digital space in particular. And as you know, the selling of Chinese digital infrastructure in various ways has been an issue for democracies, and particularly emerging democracies who have to look at the price tag and care about that. And so the European Union is at least trying to invest itself in providing an alternative source of some of those infrastructures and investing in them. Where is the US on that? And along with Chuck Coughlin, who has popped the question in the Q&A, I would take at least a part of his question is, do we have a national, do we have a national technology strategy in our apparatus now for the US? Are we part of this strategizing with the EU, or how are we thinking about it?
What a great question, and I would say kind of 50-50, where I think from a mindset perspective, we still think of critical technologies as something that have to be protected. And so we have a defense strategy around our best technologies. And an unfortunate consequence of that has been, as technology capability has grown worldwide, there are other people who are selling technologies that either we won't, or technologies at a much lower price, or technologies that are the basis for their influence. And so on the one hand, we absolutely have a technology strategy. We have a marvelous team at the White House right now who are really investing in it. We have a pretty significant historical base that governs our actions on what we will sell, what we will share, and what we will buy. That tends to be more binary than this moment. So I think that the EU's action actually highlights a really important moment, and that is technology is ubiquitous. We are well served when there are lots of providers of it. Free and open societies, being leaders in technology, serve the global purpose incredibly well. But make no mistake, policies that prohibit are not the only ones that are going to work, because there are so many more providers out there now of roughly equivalent capabilities. And so in order to be secure, you can't just prohibit, you must actually lead in the development. So a really interesting moment. And I think the European Gateway is an interesting approach to that. What do you think, Tim?
I agree. And I think the United States has responded with the DFC, the Development Finance Corporation. So it's kind of our first entry into it. It's a couple years old. And the idea is for the government to help offset a little bit of the risk in private corporations investing in developing nations. So we have to juxtapose our approach, which is a market economy founded in democracy, with the Belt and Road approach, which is they expect to lose 80% of their investment. And what they're doing is they're putting in infrastructure to authoritarian nations that can't pay it back. And that for the United States is something that we can't put onto our into our capitalistic programs. So we have the Development Finance Corporation, which is looking very closely at investment by investment, finding ways to mitigate risk, and then encouraging private investments in areas where they think that investment will be effective. So I think ours is a slightly more mature approach, perhaps more cautious. And if you asked anybody in the development, they would say it's too slow. But that's kind of the way the U.S. government approaches foreign development and aid. We want it to be impactful, and we want it to be effective, and we also want it to be to a nation that uses it to help its people. And those are requirements that aren't followed by some of our great power adversaries. So we're struggling a little bit with that paradigm right now.
Yeah, I think that's, you said it so much better than I did. There are great reasons for our system and the effect we're trying to achieve. which is raising the water level, not influencing in any undue manner. The problem is some of the other great power providers are providing real capability, a $1 billion deep water port in Djibouti, that even though it has some really significant downsides and really significant liens, is still a $1 billion deep water port in Djibouti that the United States isn't offering. And so I think this is where our policy is really trying to figure out how we are advancing free and open societies in the face of people who are offering something that is real, but the effect will be deleterious. And how do we play in that world?
So when you say advancing free and open societies, I have to pick up on the democracy summit that's happening. How do you see that in relationship to our national security apparatus? Do we have the right attitude towards the amount of soft power our hard power apparatus needs to have? Or don't know if that makes sense.
Okay, so I think I understand your question to be, are we lining up soft and hard power in a way that promotes democracy?
Correct.
Or are we just being pragmatic?
Yes. I mean, you can get a port for $1 billion, or you can come to a democracy summit. Take your pick.
Yeah, and if you read that NIC report, the National Intelligence Council report, they really talk about that. So this is what really has to happen in Washington, D.C. It can't be done elsewhere. We have to set some priorities, and we have to accept some risks. And we're not used to that, Judith. We are 25 years into being the only superpower, and we like it. And we're not now. And so in previous eras, we had to make really difficult decisions about who we were going to befriend, democracy or not, how we were going to do it, how much money and resources we were willing to do it, and also who we were going to neglect, because that's really what competition is. There aren't enough resources to go around, and we're just not at that point yet where I've seen decision makers really put it on the line. The new quadrilateral security discussion dialogue in the Pacific is a good example of something that the genesis goes before Biden and even before President Trump, when President Obama's trying to figure out how we're going to prioritize U.S. engagement in the Pacific. That's an example, but we're 10 years into that, and it's only now just starting to kind of get written down and agreed upon and acted upon. I think that's the downside of democracy. Sue?
Well, democracy is just messy, and in times of change, it looks chaotic, and totalitarianism looks somewhat attractive because you can narrow things down. So I think as a collective, the democratic states have got to continue to appreciate the foundation of our systems and find way through it. Who do we trust, and where do we set rules so that we don't fall prey to wanting to become more totalitarianism or lock it down? I think that's one. And the other thing I think is, and it's a little bit what I meant by the pesky sovereignty. I think Tim said it, from the US perspective, too often we fell into the trap of believing that partnership was you partner with us to do what we want. And that just, in this economic world, not only is it not necessarily reasonable based on what we're offering, but it's not practical based on what the gains that need to be had are. And so I think coming up with a way for us to partner more, in some cases, with people you trust on the values level, and let implementation differ. Mm-hmm. And if it's not people we can trust, then establish rules that allow us to have collective action.
Mm-hmm. So folks, I see some people are putting comments in chat and some people are putting them in Q&A, but I'll try to keep an eye on both of those places. But I I want to go back and thinking about the shape of our security apparatus and the resources we have and the things we're putting money into. And obviously we withdrew from Afghanistan, sort of that boots on the ground, huge effort. We don't want to get bogged down in that again. And yet we got Putin on the borders of Ukraine. And, are we done with boots on the ground? And if we're not going to commit to those kinds of big endeavors anymore, is our apparatus matching that, or are we still investing in being prepared to do that? Yeah.
Well, Tim, I think I'll start because I've made you take the lead on the other really tough questions. And I will say, I love these events because the questions are so smart and so challenging that we can't just give pablum answers. So I think the last 2 to 3 years have called into real question in the minds of adversaries and competitors whether we have our act together in order to respond. I worry about adventurism. In other words, for the past 5 years, the red lines have been so unclear that you have seen burbling below the surface, but pretty clearly people governing their own action to try never to cross a line that would inspire someone to do something. Mm-hmm. Now with the withdrawal from Syria, from Afghanistan and other things, our inability to respond in cyber, I see the rise of adventurism. And we're about to find two things: what's going on with Taiwan and what's going on in Ukraine. There is certainly both physical activity and political intention that would support some sort of physical move in both those theaters. Mm-hmm. I am quite confident that there is planning in terms of what we would do in various circumstances. I am less clear that from a policy perspective, we have really settled into knowing what would be our action if certain activities happen. And I think this is I want to say the word dangerous time because the norms have flown a little bit out the window. And so a miscalculation on either side could cause an outcome that neither one would have expected. But I think we're about to find the answer to your question in both Ukraine and in China. I would have said before that I wouldn't expect massive physical action on either front. But the opportunity for miscalculation on either side is pretty stark right now. What do you think, Tim?
I agree. And I would say the boots on the ground isn't going anywhere. But we would have to contextualize that and say offensive combat operations overseas are diminishing.
Right.
We've come up with this new sexy term, over the horizon counterterrorism. I don't know what that is. It sounds magical, like unicorns and glitter. But there are still problems out there. The president still has authority to go after terrorists that intend to harm the United States. I just think that it's been minimized. The grandiose ambitions of building Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan have been abandoned. And we're very pragmatic about just trying to prevent threats, which can be done with a minimal amount of forces. Sue talked about two impending threats. Obviously, our standing deterrence model hasn't worked very well, and Taiwan is being provoked. Eastern Ukraine is being provoked. There's some gamesmanship to see how this administration and previous administrations will respond. And the United States is approaching this with a new strategy called integrated deterrence. And the idea is that it isn't just military hard power, but it's economic punishment and aligning collective security agreements with neighboring nations and trying to take individuals who are supporting this, freeze their money in foreign bank accounts. So I do like that approach. I think it's more effective, especially since we don't want this to turn into a hard power conflict. But I agree with Sue. We're in a very tenuous time because if I were President Xi or President Putin, my feeling would be, if not now, never. It's not going to get better. The United States has been awoken, and we are worried about this behavior, and now we're really starting to respond to it. So the time to act is in these next few years, not after the United States has settled down, built extra capacity, increased its military superiority in all of these areas, and said, now we really feel comfortable deterring you. We're just not there yet. We've been distracted.
Did you have anything to further add, or?
No, I think I think this is a fascinating time. I do agree on the integrated response is the kind of response we always hope for. I just think it still has yet to manifest, and we have a couple of opportunities here to see how it does.
So
yeah, and I was going to say one more thing, and Sue, you know this better than anybody. Those policymakers are looking to the leaders of the intelligence community to tell them what's happening. Strategic warning, indications and warning, intentions. There's a lot of pressure on our professionals in the intelligence community now to try to call it as clear as they can. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, I can't even imagine what it's like within those halls right now. But I will also tell you that what we've learned over the past few years is what we've always known is not necessarily what it is right now. There has been significant capability growth in the hands of our adversaries. China and Russia are both very different than they were even 5 years ago. Russia a bit more brazen, so be able to know and say where we think their lines are, I think is a much tougher gig right now. And China is so much more capable and yet still more economically connected that you want to see a governor on that. But then you have Xi talking in his Communist Party annual meeting sounding like Khrushchev and previous leaders. So I think as hard as they're working, the disrupted nature of these times, coupled with the growth in capabilities, is making it hard for them to use their history to be as good a predictor as it has in the past, even in these circumstances.
And we got some thoughts from the audience too. I think Allison is commenting on the U.S.-China national security relationship and China's grip on technology, and Chuck is commenting on Russia's and our economic relationship and the leverage we really have over these two places. I think is what both of these comments go to, is the traditional leverage that we used to have over China and Russia changed, and have we responded to think about how that leverage. So I think those are just thoughts, comments. I wanted, as to the extent that we keep thinking about our apparatus and the extent to which the shape of the threats have changed. I wanted to talk. I wanted to get your thoughts a little bit about the immigration and immigrants issue on our borders and on Poland's borders, the whole notion of the weaponization of immigrants. And again, so if we think about our national security apparatus in the past, yes, we were worried about the security of our border, but our border has become a much more of a flashpoint than it ever was, in the sense of there's stuff happening on the border. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on this whole notion of how the movements of people and the potential of weaponization of immigrants and how we are protecting our borders. Is that matching up to our apparatus as it is right now? Or is that calling for changes?
So I'll start, and I'll just say, I think the most interesting thing about the past few years is just the recognition that what's happening at our borders, what's happening with pandemics, what's happening with climate, what's happening with supply chain, food insecurity, economic security is actually national security.
Mhm.
And if you think about the massive national security apparatus we have to include the intelligence apparatus buried within that, has been relatively unfocused on those issues. That doesn't mean the US government hasn't been focused on those issues, but the national security apparatus has not devoted massive resources to intelligence surrounding those issues. And so the question of the moment, I think, is now that we know that those are big threats to our security writ large, what does the national security apparatus have to offer? And then how do you build the capabilities so it can offer that? Because it's really easy over time to start believing that the apparatus is only what it has always been. You know, our national security apparatus really grew of age in the Cold War when we built satellites to collect information at distance. And that was going after a particular threat. None of those things were really designed against any of the threats we have right now. So the question is, what does the national security have to offer on these new national security issues? What will it take to develop the insight that has fueled our advance of the others? And how do you put that into play, especially when it won't be limited to those organizations that are used to playing with one another? So it's a really interesting time organizationally to figure out how we not only put resources in terms of dollars, but investment in terms of capability against these new challenges, and where does that come from?
Yeah, and I would say that the politicization of immigration has made this even more pressing. And so you have a resource gap, and the laws are in place, the capabilities are built, but you just don't have enough. And I don't think enough is affordable. So they're going to have to figure out ways to address this on the other side of the border, the kind of the supply side. And they're going to have to figure out ways that reflect American values on how to deal with these people, many of whom do not have ulterior motives of crime or neglect, are trying to get away from something, and America has to come to terms with how to improve the situations. I think, Judith, that this directly relates to the Fragile States Index, and so many of these countries being so horrible in terms of their support by the government to help the people, all sorts of, food shortages, sanitation shortages. So the essence of the problem is fragile nations. The manifestation of the problem is immigration. I'm not saying the United States can solve every country's governance issues, but we should have a holistic approach, and we should be realistic about the amount of resources that we can allocate to this problem. And the one final thing I'd say from what Sue said is this really challenges us in a different way, because it touches a seam in our national security apparatus. The intelligence facing outward and the intelligence once folks are in the United States. It's been referred to as the wall. It's been referred to as the green line. It's been referred to as a bunch of other characteristics, but the US intelligence community is very cautious about using its magnificent resources once someone becomes a US person. And we live by that. That's a reflection of our values. And to change that would jeopardize some of the trust that we have between the Americans, Congress, and our intelligence community.
So
I think that's I think that's the issue is we're a nation of laws. I don't believe in the escalation of government privilege. That is a bright line with our citizens, but the discipline of intelligence would be useful in this moment, more so than the discipline of law enforcement exclusively. And I think that's an interesting challenge.
So both of you have been talking about intelligence, and actually earlier on, Grace asked a question about disinformation and the role of the intelligence community in battling disinformation. And I know we've had several students at Duke, fellows in our fellows program, who have been working on various issues around the military's communication strategy, the United States communication strategy, more broadly speaking. And I know students who worked on the questions of disinformation and countering violent extremism, and it seems to be seated in so many different agencies, organizations within the US government. You know, USAID does some stuff, the Department of State does some stuff, the military does. And so how are we supposed to get the maximum out of our efforts to counter misinformation if we're not coordinated on what we're trying to do in that sphere? And what can we do to fix that?
Yeah, let me just say a few things. Number one, welcome to Sue Gordon's life. Yeah, that's exactly the challenges that she faced in Washington. The intelligence community, I'll just give a little bit, and Sue, this is really your area of expertise. But number one, I think the intelligence community's done a pretty good job of exposing disinformation for policymakers. Like, they can go to a policymaker and say, this country had this influence on this entity using these systems, they did it, right? And then it's really a policymaker, if the country is external, it's a policymaker decision as to what to do. The 2016 election is a good example of that. They had really good information about how things happened, and they presented them to policymakers. What policymakers do, that is what a democracy must decide. And the second piece is, if you're suggesting that the intelligence community participate in disinformation or influence operations overseas, of course we do that. That's part of the 1947 National Security Act, but the purpose is typically tied to some democratic principle or some value or some behavior that we hope to influence overseas. So I just wanted to make sure that when we talk about the intelligence community, there's two pieces. There's the analytical piece, finding it and suggesting what might be able to be done. And then the other is doing it in a manner that furthers US policy objectives. Sue?
We could have a whole talk just on this. I think that the advance of trust and being able to identify what is true, not from a content perspective, but from a pedigree perspective, is going to be so important going forward to our collective efforts. I do think one of the most interesting things, to Tim's point about the intelligence community and the ability to identify foreign actions to influence and to distinguish what is rather than what appears to be, is something that is our age-old craft, and we're getting better and better at seeing that. I think what's different about is who are you sharing that information with? And starting in 2016, the intelligence community dipped its toe in sharing that assessment with the American people in an unclassified form, rather than just to policymakers, recognizing that the people that were being affected needed the information. I think that will be one of the most interesting things to watch over the coming years, is who the intelligence apparatus serves perhaps changes. Does it need to serve business leaders because they're national security leaders? Does it need to serve directly our citizenry because they need to have the access to shaping activities? And how does it do that without being influencing itself is, I think, going to be one of the more interesting things to watch unfold.
Well, we're winding down on the hour here, but I wanted to ask you one final question, which is, it's a version of two questions. You can pick which one of these questions you would like to answer, but they're two sides of the same coin. You know, if you were to draw the blueprint for our national security apparatus, and you could do it from scratch, how much would it resemble what we currently have? Or answer the other question, which is the other side of the coin, which was, you know, if you were president for a day or a month or something like this, and you could do anything to our national security apparatus, what would it be? Tim, why don't we go first with you?
First of all, the line would be Duke Blue, for sure, right down the middle. Okay, I think we have good bones in our structure. We need to invite more talented people to come into government, people who study and work hard and get some experience. We need more people in government. And then we need the congressional committees to really address their structure and how it impedes agility in the executive branch. That's going to be a really hard ask, but it needs to be done. And the second thing is our legislation should ask the cabinet agencies to redo themselves about every 10 years and to give them the authority to redo themselves in such a way that it doesn't look like a negative, it looks like a positive. We don't have any of that. And so we become so intractable that we end up chasing sunk costs or not being innovative or responding after the fact. So those are the things that I would put my time and attention in towards if we were able to actually have a positive influence. Sue?
I would try and forget that 1947 ever happened. I would try and imagine that the National Security Act hadn't been written at that time and say that today was the first day we thought of an organized national security apparatus and design it for what it would look like today. And I will tell you that it would not look the same as it did in 47 because it's a very different world. So that's number one. Two, I'd cut its resources significantly, in part because over time and with the threats that the nation has faced, it has been incredibly well resourced and its mission has just exploded. It got bigger. So I'd cut resources. And then three, I would expand the number of agencies that had a national security mission, because if commerce doesn't understand that in technology and in space it has a role, if transportation doesn't, we're going to be stuck. And if you keep it with the institutions that today have it, you will not get the modern approaches. So those are the three things I'd do.
Well, folks, there you have it. Vote for the Gordon Nichols ticket. And I'm sorry we couldn't get precisely to all the questions, but I also appreciate that folks in the audience were just kind of also sharing comments with each other. Thank you to Duke and DC for hosting this this event, and we're hoping to actually physically come together in Duke and DC before too long and pick up this conversation on national security. So thank you very much for joining us today and have a great evening.